always been a company that I've been pretty interested in. They've always been innovative, they've always brought out updates when people want them, they've listened to their consumers in the same way that I think Sony have, where they update their cameras and really change things to what people want. In the past I have owned some Fuji cameras, so I had a couple of X-T2s and some prime lenses that went with it. I had an X100T and I was thinking recently about getting an XE3 just for personal work and stuff like that. I haven't decided to go ahead with that yet. I'm still deciding what I want to do. But for my professional work, I always preferred Sony, just with their focus systems being really on top of the game, image quality being full frame, and that really shallow depth of field has always been something that sort of attracted me to the system. Today I had a photo shoot for a charity called Oxfam. I'm sure a lot of you guys know it, but they had an artist doing some murals for an installation down in Auckland City. So I was there doing some behind the scenes shots. I was a little bit early to the shoot, so I decided to stop off at Auckland Camera. It was on the way, have a chat to the boys there and just see what was going on. I was talking to someone over at the Fuji cabinet, a customer that was having a look at the cameras, and I decided that I would just borrow one of the X-T3s and the 23mm 1.4 to go and take along to the shoot, and I shot it side by side with my A7III and the 35mm 1.4 Zeiss. So when you're talking about 23 versus 35mm, with the crop factor they end up being about the same, so it's a good equivalent focal length, both being 1.4s, but you lose a little bit of that depth of field with the Fuji camera being a crop sensor. Now the best way I can put the Fuji cameras versus the Sony cameras in my mind is kind of like an old classic car. It's really fun to drive. It's a really kind of in-depth process. You have to be a little bit more patient with them, where the Sony cameras are just like a really modern Mercedes with all the new tech in it. You know, they're very powerful, very impressive focus systems, really amazing image quality. The Fujis, you can get a pretty close result. You just go about it in a different way. So one thing I really love about the Fuji cameras is all the dials you have on top. It's really reminiscent of using one of my old film cameras from back in the day, and I just really enjoy that process. I don't want this to turn into like a big techie review, but we'll talk about build quality, image quality, focus system, and all that just a little bit. So the build quality of the X-T3 is really fantastic. It's at least as good as the Sony cameras in my opinion, and some ways better, some ways not as good, but generally it's just a really well built camera. I like that it has two SD card slots. I like all the dials on the top like I mentioned before. I like the fact that they're weather sealed. The only thing that I'm not too impressed with is the battery life. They do have that smaller battery because the grip is quite small, but hopefully in the next generation they'll bring out a bigger grip with a larger battery inside it. One thing you've got to talk about when you're talking about Fuji cameras is those lenses, those prime lenses. Even some of the zoom lenses are really impressive, and I noticed straight away that the 35 1.4 versus the 23 1.4, the Sony version had a whole bunch more chromatic aberration. They were both very sharp, but the Sony had a whole lot more chromatic aberration in it. It's easily fixed in post, so it's not a big deal, but it's worth mentioning. In terms of image quality, I think it's pretty obvious that the Sony would have an upper hand here. Just being a larger sensor, they usually have better color depth, more sharpness, better in low light, and all that sort of stuff. Saying that, the Fuji is a very impressive crop sensor camera, and I think in terms of a crop sensor, it's really on top of its game. One of the downsides with using a crop sensor, it may not be a downside for everybody, but for me, I really like shooting at 1.4 in a full frame and getting that really creamy depth of field. You just can't get that with a crop sensor the same way you can get it with a full frame. So really, as you're looking at all these images, the main thing that sets them apart is the depth of field. I wouldn't really have to put the Sony and the Fuji badge next to them, because you can really tell just from the depth of field in most of the images, especially when you're closer to the subject. The files straight out of the camera, I'm not a big fan of the Fuji RAW files, not that there's anything wrong with them. I don't think they're technically flawed or anything. I just prefer the Sony files. It may be because I'm used to them, but it's just my personal preference rather than a right or wrong. One of the really big things that stood out for me was the focus system. While it is good for a mirrorless camera, it's really impressive. It's just not quite up to the same standard as the Sonys, and the eye focus was a little bit frustrating, so I had to turn it off. Again, if you look at my previous video, I didn't actually talk about Fuji's when I was talking about the eye focus comparisons, but it's just the way you go about using it. So with the Fuji system, it seems that even if you have it in single point focus, if it picks up an eye in the frame, it'll override that and just pick up the eye even if you don't want it to. So it's a little bit frustrating. So I ended up turning it off and just using the single point mode. But in terms of the focus system itself, AFC works really fast, AFS is really good, low light focusing is good, it's just not quite up to that standard of the Sony cameras. As I said in the start of the video, it's really just a personal preference of which brand you like. I think in terms of cameras in general these days, Sony and Fuji are definitely on top of the game. I'm sure Canon and Nikon are going to come out with some really amazing stuff with their next releases. It is worth mentioning the size of these cameras. So because they're a crop sensor, everything else can be smaller. So the lenses are smaller and lighter, the body is smaller. Where the Sony cameras are full frame, the lenses just have to be larger. Saying that, it really depends on the lens you use. So the 24mm G Master, which I'm filming on now, and the A7 III is really not a heavy combo. But if you use the 35 1.4, it is heavier. It's still not as bad as like a full DSLR Pro body, but they're heavier than the Fuji cameras, and it's just the way it is with crop sensor versus full frame at this stage in technology. I think the main difference that you're going to have to weigh up is just have a look at them, touch them for yourselves, take them out, see if you can borrow one or rent one, try each camera and just see what works for you. I don't think it really matters at the end of the day what you buy. I think both of them are fantastic. You just have to use them differently, and there's benefits and downsides to each system. As always, in the description below there'll be a link to download some of these raw files from the Sony and the Fuji cameras. Download them, have a play with them, drop a comment below and let me know what you think of them. Thanks for watching this video, guys. I'll see you tomorrow with the next update.